good jobs, and comfortable homes under the Nazis. The price was the loss of freedom, but a starving man will always sell his birthright for a mess of pottage. Hitler is dead, and the Nazi bid for the world empire has ended in overwhelming defeat and universal hatred of the German people who followed after their false star, and are still held responsible for their crimes. Equally disillusioned by the Nazis and by democracy, the German people today are adrift and hopeless. If democracy could inspire them with hope as strong as that once inspired by the false Nazi prophets, all Europe might be saved. But we, the victors, treat them as a pariah people by giving them little or no support to the German Democrats, demonstrate that the latter are as incapable today as 2 decades ago for winning the Germans the right to work for their own support and be accorded an equal status with other European nations. Only a little knowledge of history is required to refute the popular belief that the Germans are naturally more aggressive than the French or English or any other people. Each of these peoples has, in turn, been the aggressor according to its power, its opportunities, and the ambitions of its rulers. It serves no purpose to appropriation, blame, since almost all nations at one time or another have been aggressors in Europe, Africa, or Asia, or even Americans have waged wars of conquest on their continent. The survival of Western civilization now depends on our ability to forget old injustices, rise above national prejudice, and heal the scars of war. Unless the interesting feuds of Europe are ended, and we start acting according to the principles we profess to believe in, the communists will conquer. The first had peace produced Hitler. The second is giving us Stalin. Only revived faith in the principles we profess to believe in, and our determination to put them into practice, can preserve Western civilization. The insidious influence of totalitarian doctrine and the decay of democratic principles is reflected in the changing attitude of the United States between the 2 world wars. During World War I, President Wilson endeavored to make American allies listen to the voice of reason and humanity, and appealed for a peace without annexations and indemnities, end quote, to make the world safe for democracy. But during and after World War II, the President of the United States began the foremost exponent of the policy of all spoils to the victors, and took no account of the Atlantic Charter he had himself drawn up. It was President Roosevelt who sold out Poland and China at Yalta and delivered Eastern Europe to the communist terror. It was President Roosevelt who agreed with Stalin that reparations in kind should be exacted by use of the Germans as slave laborers. It was also the Democratic President of the United States who sponsored the Montague Plan for the death by starvation of millions of Germans, and agreed to the exportation and expulsion of millions of Germans from Silesia, East Prussia, the Sudetenland, and the Balkans for the sole crime of belonging to the German race. It was Churchill, the Tory imperialist, not Roosevelt, the American Democrat, who stood up to Stalin at Yalta, Yalta, when the dictator of all the Russians proposed the massacre of thousands of German officers after victory. It was Churchill, not Roosevelt, or his liberal aides, who tried to save Europe from communist domination and terror by advocating a strategy which would have kept the Russians out of Eastern Europe and could have prevented the sacrifices of the war from resulting in nothing but the substitution of one totalitarian tyranny for another. There is a notation at the bottom of this page saying this. This is not intended as a defense of Winston Churchill, who was too short-sighted or too exhilarated by his own eloquence to realize the disastrous consequence of all-out aid to Stalin's Russia. As compared with Franklin D. Roosevelt, however, Churchill can claim to have been a statesman. Going on with the text. President Wilson was broken and died after his failure either to persuade America's allies to agree to a just peace or to get support of the Congress for the League of Nations, which he thought would compensate for the concessions he had been forced to make at Versailles to the greed, fears, and ambitions of the victors. President Roosevelt died before the consequences of his repudiation of moral values in the treatment of the defeated enemy peoples and his readiness to sacrifice principles and interests in further of his great design had become fully apparent. But before his death, he must have known that Stalin would not honor the commitments won from him at the cost of betraying Poland and China, delivering Eastern Europe to the communist rule, and putting the Soviet dictator in a position to menace all Europe while taking over China. Both Democratic presidents failed, but Wilson had fought for justice, whereas Roosevelt had sacrificed it to expediency and staked the future of the world on which he admitted was a gamble, and on his faith in his ability to charm the Soviet dictator. The consequences of Roosevelt's, quote, successes, end quote, were more disastrous than Wilson's failures. The United Nations proved from its inception to be a greater failure than Wilson's League of Nations, and has already in fact been discarded in favor of the Atlantic Pact with the enemies of Soviet Russia. The contrast between attitude and aims of Wilson and Roosevelt was a reflection of the changed philosophy of the liberals. During and after World War I, the liberals had pleaded for a just peace, excused national and racial prejudices, and endeavored to combat the influence of nationalism and more fostered hatred among peoples. But during and after World War II, so-called liberals and progressives took the lead in demanding the crucifixion of the whole German people. If the forces of Western democracy had been weakened by the influence of totalitarians masquerading as liberals or corrupted by communist influence, the communists have lost part of their strength by having divested communism of its original humanitarian content and international appeal. None but the ignorant, the blind, and a few self-seeking men of large ambition and little talent now believe that communism offers mankind a more just social order or a greater equality between men, nation, and races. The difference in attitude and policies of the communists today and 20 years ago, this is written in 1949, is best illustrated by their behavior towards Germany. Here, the contrast between the past and present altitudes and preferred ideals and present practices is most clearly displayed. In 1917, Lenin proclaimed the unity of the workers of the world, denounced war as an imperialistic struggle which offered the hand of friendship to the German people while repudiating the nationalist war aims of both the Tsarist and Kerensky governments. Under his leadership, the communists were internationalists in both theory and practice. They had no more enmity toward the German people than any others because they regarded the masses in every country as victims of capitalist tyranny and imperialistic ambition. A quarter of a century later, Stalin, having built on the foundations laid by Lenin, but with a totally different conception of the structure which was meant to be erected, had transformed Russia into a national socialist state and was wreaking a terrible vengeance on the whole German people for having not followed its national socialist leaders instead of Russia's. And whereas Lenin had announced all territorial ambitions of the Tsars, Stalin was demanding all and more than they had ever dreamed of acquiring in Egypt and Asia. The degeneration of communism and of democracy having proceeded on parallel lines, it was natural that the Western powers and Soviet Russia could agree only on one thing: vengeance upon their defeated enemies. Communism having been a cinnamon for the interests of the rulers of Russia, and democracy having succumbed to the insidious poison of national hatred, the victors of World War II combined to despoil and enslave the Germans. Whereas hatred is a powerful weapon in the hands of the communists, it debilitates the enemies of tyranny. Our hands have been tied by our intimate association with the tyrants, whose only quarrel with Hitler was his refusal to make common cause with Russia's National Socialists. Communism has lost the liberal savor, which once gave its moral force, but its appeal has not yet been nullified by its inhumane acts and its prostitution in the interests of Stalin's dictatorship. Stalin was wiser than Hitler, who ignored Machiavelli's precept that to succeed, a tyrant must either kill off all opposition or consolidate his enemies. Whereas the numbers of victims consigned to the Soviet concentration camps who have escaped its infamous, many Jews and Democrats who had either suffered in Hitler's prisons or had friends or relatives in them were allowed to go abroad and tell the world about Nazi atrocities. Hence the widespread knowledge of Nazi crimes and the little information in the democratic countries considering the torture and death of millions of victims of communist tyranny. Let me repeat that one more time. Hence the widespread knowledge of Nazi crimes and the little information in the democratic countries concerning the torture and death of millions of victims of communist tyranny. Because Hitler was a little less ruthless or efficient than Stalin in exterminating his enemies, the atrocities committed by the Soviet government are far less widely known than the record of Nazi crime. This is one reason why the echo of communism's original humanitarianism and international appeal still evokes a response among idealists who know nothing and refuse to learn anything about Stalin's Russia. But the main appeal of communism today is that the most irrational and destructive impulses to which human nature is heir. By playing upon our hatreds and passions, the communists foster and inflame class, racial, and national antagonisms and cause us to act against our own interests and the cause of freedom. Since the war's end, they have been successful in propagating the idea that mercy, justice, charity, and goodwill are signs of fascist sympathies. Years ago, when I went to live in the Soviet Union, the communist attitude toward human behavior, menschlichkeit, was first revealed to me by the notice I read in Sevastopol under the portrait of a certain Russian general who commanded the Tsar's troops in the Crimean War. General X was a most terrifying enemy of the working class. By treating his soldiers kindly, he sought to dull their class consciousness. Since the communist aim is to perpetuate or create the condition of chaos and misery, which alone can give them the opportunity to seize power, it is natural that they should not only oppose the Marshall Plan, but also exert their influence to exacerbate the old hatreds and resentments which kept their enemies divided. The best and wisest of the Jewish people cannot be seduced by the communist appeal to the natural but irrational desire to exact retribution from all Germans for the murder and torture of their race by the Nazis. Intelligent and liberal Jews have been among the leading opponents of communists and have rejected the communist conception of collective guilt and punishment of the innocent and guilty alike. But being human, many Jews are as petty in the hands of the communists, who appeal to their desire for revenge in order to soften up Europe for Soviet conquest. The communists have likewise successfully appealed to the hatred of the Poles, the Czechs, and others who suffered at German hands, using these passions as a means to deliver the liberated peoples into Stalin's hands. Thus, the Czechs who expropriated and expelled the 3 million people of the Sudan land are today themselves being converted